Hey, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm sitting here with the great Greg Richling. How are you?
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. We connected on the wonderful world of Facebook.
Yes, we did. It's age appropriate.
It is, isn't it? Nothing says over 40 than like Facebook.
That's right. Exactly.
Yes, it's an interesting world we live in with Facebook. But we won't go into that whole world.
You missed that conversation.
Thank God.
Absolutely.
So you're born and bred in Los Angeles.
I'm a local native. That's
wow.
Right. Yeah. West side Los Angeles, right near the Mormon Temple.
Nice.
The Jew near the Mormon Temple.
There you go. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, those people that know you will know you as a very famous bass player.
Some do, maybe.
No, it's quite all right. And I'd like to know a little bit about your journey, how you got started.
Sure.
Because you were with the Wallflowers for how long?
Over 20 years.
20 years, wow.
Yeah. Kind of typical upbringing, grew up in Los Angeles, played in high school bands. I was a drummer in one band, I was a bass player in another, so I hadn't really kind of decided where I was headed with that. And, when I went off to college, I also had an interest in film, so around '88 I went to Boston University, College of Communication, I made 3 films, but all the while, played in a rock group out there. I think like a lot of kids at that age, I had different interests, and there was a little bit of, go where the wind blows, so to speak, and, where the opportunities were opening up, is kind of where I went. But I really kind of in my heart knew that I enjoyed playing music, and original music. So I came back to Los Angeles after graduation, and I was a runner. I was going up and down the 101 to photochem and delivering film and, thinking, God, is this it? What's the future hold for me? I hadn't played in a band in about a year, and I was missing it. And then the good fortune hit where I reconnected with Jakob Dylan, who I had been in high school with. And he had formed the Wallflowers already, and they had fired their bass player around 93. So about 6 months into working in the film business, I went out to a club that a lot of people maybe know called the Three of Clubs.
I remember the Three of Clubs.
Yeah, on La Brea. I ran into a friend of mine, Dave Cerno, and he said, "You've got to call Tobi Miller, the guitar player of the band at the time. They're looking for a new bass player. They're going on the road in 1 week opening for 10,000 Maniacs, and then going to do like a month-long club tour." So I said, hey, you know what, I'm going to try out. I was a fan of the group already because they were my friends, and I just, I couldn't believe that, all these 21-year-olds that I grew up with had actually got signed to Virgin and made a record. So by ear, being a fan already, I kind of knew about 8 of the 12 songs. So after the rehearsal, which was done in our friend Ivy's garage right behind the whiskey, after, playing about an hour with them, they said, well, you got the gig. Do you want to do the tour? And I said, can you give me an hour to make a decision? And they said, yeah, but you've got 1 hour because we're leaving in 7 days for this tour.
Sure.
And so I went home, and I know this sounds corny, but, I was still young. I got a hold of my mother. I went home and I said, I've got this opportunity to go on the road with Jakob's band. I said, I haven't been in a band in a year. She said, this is a great opportunity. You got to take it. I spent the rest of the week learning about 25 songs and going into rehearsal. I took the bus up to Salem, Oregon, and played my first show in front of 4,000 people in an open air, pavilion. They hired me full time in the middle of that tour, and it lasted 20 years. Obviously, with a lot in between, but it was quite a ride. Yeah.
So, which album was that touring on?
I toured the last tour of the first album on Virgin, which was a self-titled record that at the time sold about 40,000 copies.
Which now is quite huge.
Which now is yeah, exactly. It used to be like half of 1 week's sales if your record was being pushed, right?
Yeah.
But I went out on the road with the band and kind of did that whole thing.
I loved hearing him sing as well. I mean, was that the first like big hit, or was it One Headlight? I can't remember which order they came in.
So 6th Avenue Heartache. So what subsequently, after we toured around, and did a lot of these local shows, we did electric shows at the Vipe Room and acoustic shows at the Mint. Every label that didn't want to sign us 9 months prior, now everybody wanted to sign us because I think we kind of fit the mold of what the pros were doing, and everyone, as you know, the way the industry works, they had to have their version of that thing. And so we ended up going with Interscope because it was the beginning of the label, and at the time you know, unlike say like a Geffen Records that had a ton of rock bands, you know, what they had, you know, Beck, Peter Gabriel, Guns N' Roses, they had a ton of acts that we thought, you know, competed in our genre. And the appeal from Interscope was, you know, we don't have any mainstream rock bands, and that's Jimmy's background. And,
Sure.
you know, we've got some rap, we have some alternative, you know, they had Nine Inch Nails, they had No Doubt. But we were really kind of a part of that initial group of bands that kind of launched Interscope, you know. You know, Eminem.
I mean, I personally enjoyed that period.
Yeah, it was, you know, I made a decision in the early 2000s when Napster hit and everything kind of went pear-shaped. I made a decision that I wasn't going to be the kind of guy that kind of pined away for the past, but I can't say that I don't enjoy, you know, I did enjoy that period in music where things just kind of worked simply like a business, right? You know, you had a budget, you went in, you made a record in a great sounding studio with a great team, and you came out with an album, they promoted it, people bought the product. I do miss that aspect of it just being a regular business that works, you know?
Sure.
And I think so much now of at least what I've been trying to work on, we'll get to that, but so much of where things have gone center around, you know, just trying to kind of repair everything that's been dismantled and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, everybody deserves to be paid for what they're doing, and you're buying a commodity. This isn't, you know, you don't walk into the market and decide the price of steak's too expensive and walk out with it in your back pocket, you know, except that, you know, because this is, you know, a 3-minute pop song that can be ripped at home, it's turned into quite a disaster for everyone. And I think we're slowly working our way out of it.
Oh, we're definitely,
you know?
yeah, we're definitely figuring it out.
Yeah, but I did enjoy that aspect of being at Interscope and just having things work.
It was actually, as much as, you know, we look at grunge in the very early 90s, it was actually a natural progression, because what was great, at least in my humble opinion, with Nirvana on their second album in particular, is not actually the second album, it's their third album, because of course Bleach was their first, but their second big album on Geffen is when they made In Utero, they did it very live and, dare I say it, like a roots kind of album.
That's right.
And so to me, Counting Crows and Wallflowers is a natural extension of that, because you're going into a room, you're all playing live. I know you did the album with Neal, who's
that's right.
You know, a very talented, incredibly talented, good friend of mine. And
sure.
You go in, you play live, you fix things, as opposed to like tracking it, editing it tight.
Yeah.
It was a natural progression from grunge anyway.
Yeah. I think what you're saying now kind of ties into, you know, in the early 2000s, I kind of, you know, on breaks from tours, realized that I was very interested in the production side, not from the engineer standpoint, but the standpoint of, you know, working with bands, going in rehearsal halls, ironing out, you know, issues and going in and recording groups as a live entity, right? A lot of that, I think, just has to do with the era that we grew up. You know, we're not that old, but, you know, the golden age that we refer to, you know, 60s, 70s, 80s, where, you know, bands knew how to play. They got in a room, they rehearsed, they went in the studio, they took a snapshot of what they were doing as a group, and the understanding that the interplay that's going on in real time is actually really, really important, right? And I, you know, can admittedly say that I struggled in the sort of middle 2000s with the approach to recording. When I got a job to produce a record for Norway's biggest mainstream rock band, Big Bang, around 2009. And I had been sort of managing myself on the production side, but that got to a point where now I was dealing with foreign royalty rates and things that I didn't understand. So I only got real management for producing when I just kind of couldn't handle it on my own anymore. And I took a meeting with Mike, and the first thing I said to him was, I just want to be clear, I am not the father figure producer, kind of, you know, get in here, layer the cake, have the drummer come in, have the bass player, and kind of, you know, put things together in that fashion. You know, I'm very sort of definitive about how I like to make records. I just really feel like, you know, if you're a techno thing or you're, you know, a hip hop thing, I understand obviously the aspect of, you know, putting things together and piecing them and layering. But I come from a world of bands and rock and roll and songwriting, and I just feel like extremely strong about the performance-based activity of capturing bands. I think, you know, You don't finally go in to represent this thing that's going to be out there forever, and that's the one time that you don't play together. And that, I saw that happening. In fact, I'll say, like, the first time Warren and I talked about me coming in and doing this, we had both kind of had a chuckle or a cry, I don't know, about the idea that we were coming up against a lot of bands when we were up for producing stuff that hadn't really ever recorded together as a unit. With obviously with Pro Tools and the ability to kind of edit and maybe not look at it as a recording interface, but more of like an over-editing capability. People got kind of carried away with perfection and all sorts of things that kind of sucked the life out of what we love about listening to the Police or the Rolling Stones or the Clash, where there's evidence that humans were there and made these things, and it's okay if the kick's a little off in the second verse and a couple of beats, and it's not the end of the world.
All right, so as we're just touching off camera, let's talk about the making of Bringing Down the Horse then.
Yeah, so I'd say probably around that era that we're talking about, 1994, we were looking for a producer for the second record, and T-Bone Burnett is someone that Jakob's known for a long time. He was obviously in the Rolling Thunder band with Jakob's father, Bob, and been a family friend a long time, and it just kind of made sense, that we would go in. He had just done the Counting Crows debut record, and he did some other records that we were fans of back in the 80s, like the first Bodines record. Will the Wolf Survive by Los Lobos was like a really big record, that we loved, and but again, like very organic, right? Because T-Bone's a musician and he's been in bands since, back in Texas with the Alpha Band and David Mansfield and all those guys. He just kind of understands the process of what bands need to go through when they're young and making a record. And what I mean by understanding bands is that prior to making that record, like literally right before we made the album, we lost our guitar player. Our drummer ran off with Natalie Merchant because they started dating as we did the tour together. So we were sort of a band that got signed and we were falling apart at the same time, right?
Michael became your guitar player.
Michael was one of the guitar players that T-Bone brought in to fill the void.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Michael... obviously he was with School of Fish. He had his own band.
Chad Fisher was a very old, dear friend of mine.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
I own his old house.
He was the drummer, right?
He was the drummer.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Oh, funny. Small world, right? So, like as I said, it was a weird feeling because we were losing members as we were a band on a new label. So part of T-Bone's responsibility was to figure out the guitar chair, since we didn't have one. Thankfully, they had asked me, what drummer I wanted to play with, and I had been really into Edie Brickell's second record, Ghost of a Dog, and Matt Chamberlain was just kind of starting his career out. So I didn't even really know him, like, hey, it's Matt Chamberlain. He wasn't there yet, right?
Yep.
So I just said, I like this guy, Matt Chamberlain, who's on this Edie Brickell record. I don't think he's in the band anymore. And fatefully, it seems, Tony Berg, who produced that record, was in our sphere and we knew him. Tony recommended Matt as I was asking for Matt. So
nice.
Matt was on the road with a band called Weapon of Choice, Lonnie Marshall's kind of funk band that was on Stone Gossard from Pearl Jam's label, Loose Groove. Yep.
Check them out.
Yeah. And so the deal was, hey, Greg, go down to the Club Lingerie and meet Matt because Weapon of Choice is doing a gig. So I went down there, we hit it off. I said, hey, we've got a record deal, really love your drumming. I'd love if you played on the record. Oh, he was, he's a great guy. Anybody knows him. He's really easygoing. He stayed at he stayed at one of the band members' houses at the time, and we did a bunch of demos. And, he ended up doing the record with us, and he wasn't terribly into like joining a band at the time. He was sort of getting into the session world. And I think he kind of springboarded into doing a lot of sessions off of our record, and then, T-Bone knowing about him and putting him on Sam Phillips' album, and things kind of dominoed, and, he became the drumming great that he is now. And it's hard for me to believe I've known him for almost 25 years.
Oh, he's an insane player.
Yeah, we went on to play together on Macy Gray's debut and Fiona Apple's debut record, and 2 Wallflowers albums. And
yeah, there was a period for about 20 years where every record was either Matt Chamberlain or Victor Indrizzo.
That's right.
Or both.
That's right.
You'd pick up an album, you'd be like, half the songs would be Matt and the other half would be Victor Indrizzo.
That's right.
Matt Chamberlain and Victor Indrizzo, just insane.
Yeah. There's so many good drummers in town. I mean, there's, some of the guys I've gotten to play with, it's funny, right? Like I kind of went on as a bass player in my career, but I've always been more interested in drummers. I very rarely talk about bass players. I think it's because, that's obviously, who you're playing with in a section, but I've had a chance to play with, on records, Josh Freese and Matt Chamberlain, but other guys like Denny Fongheiser is a phenomenal drummer. And
Denny's one of the first drummers I ever worked with.
I love Denny. Yeah. I love him as a person, and he's a very creative drummer. He's one of those guys like Matt that are just always searching for something unique.
I'd like to find an excuse to work with him again on something.
He's fantastic.
He played drums on my first album. Chad.
Oh, wow.
Chad Fisher did about half the album. Brian did almost the other half of the album, Brian MacLeod. And then, which I'm sure you've worked with.
I've met Brian. We've both been working in different rooms at Sunset Sound at times, but he's a phenomenal drummer. I mean, it goes without saying, Yeah.
And there was one song on the album that we added, and Denny was the drummer.
Oh, wow, yeah. Well, the story of him playing on Counting Crows, Mr. Jones.
No, what happened?
Yeah, so, not to divert too much, but
no, it's okay.
The funny story that I guess the drummer in the Counting Crows, Steve Bowman, the original drummer, he didn't want to play on that song. I don't know if, I can't claim to know why. I don't know if he just didn't like the song or for whatever reason. So T-Bone, I think, was forced to bring a guy in to play on that song. And he brought Denny in because he was using Denny with, some other records that he was working on, like Jocko Pierce and some things. And so Denny is actually the drummer on Mr. Jones. And the other,
there you go.
And Steve.
You heard it here first.
You heard it, yeah. People probably know that. Some people.
25 years later, 25 you heard it here first.
I think he was credited. I think he was. But, I always found that interesting. Like, how would I feel if I said no to
Well, especially Denny, because Denny is, Denny's a remarkable drummer. My memory is really clear of him because he walks two worlds. Like, he's an incredibly technical drummer. Like, he could out-jazz most jazz drummers.
Yeah, he's terrific. Yeah.
Like, he's really technically gifted. But he also can play with enough groove and feel that T-Bone Burnett would hire him.
That's right. That's
quite difficult. Most of the time, and I won't, there's a lot of drummers that just have that kind of swampy groove. Yeah. But you wouldn't expect them to.
No, you're right. Well, what happened?
He can do both.
No, he can. And the reason that I met Denny was because there was a period where Matt Chamberlain thought that he wasn't going to be able to make the record. Something came up. And we rehearsed with Denny over at Cole. Because we thought, well, we got to find a new guy.
Cole, there's a blast from the past.
Yeah, that's where I met Denny. Was I thought he might be doing the record, and then Matt came back and said, "No, I'm going to do it. I can do it." But
he was probably a little threatened by Denny.
I don't know. Who knows? I don't even know if he knew he was in the running.
No, I'm just teasing.
But no, of course. But to end that segment of it, I think what Denny and Matt kind of share, which I don't see all the time, is that sort of unique percussive element. They're always searching for something different, right? Like sound-wise, and I think they're both very sort of like the new Keltners, if you will. I mean, they're not new; they've been around a long time now. But I know Keltner and Matt have a really tight relationship, and
makes sense.
And he sees a lot in him. I think Keltner sees a lot in Matt. That
totally.
So.
Well, I always, and this is all humble and very opinionated.
Yeah, sure.
I always felt with Keltner that he was America's version of Ringo and Charlie Watts and even Keith Moon. He had an ability to play the song, but bring a lot of kind of almost wrongness.
Yeah.
When I was a kid and I used to listen to American rock, and Americans are going to disagree with me, it always seemed to sound so much more sophisticated and perfect than ours. Yeah. Ours was not necessarily bands like The Fall, but even our classic rock bands were just a little bit more wrong and a bit more edgy. Yeah. And then I'd listen to like REO Speedwagon or Kansas, and it was like, which were great bands, but they were just a little bit more perfect.
Yeah, very arranged. Keltner definitely.
Keltner can like play with Lennon and just take Ringo's spot, and it makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
he can play with George Harrison.
Yeah,
he's take greasy. Ringo's spot. Yeah, he's greasy.
He's greasy. He's swampy. He really
plays the song.
He does, and he just adds that molasses kind of. He glues everything together in such a unique way.
Sure, and I feel like the guys like Denny, Matt, and Victor, and Blair Sinta. These guys, these younger guys, are able to play modern enough, which means basically playing pretty darn solid to a click, like super modern, but still have enough swamp. And that is like, it's a real drummer discussion here. That is the thing. It's, can you play super tight? But just put in enough just to make me move a little. Well, going back to what you were saying, we used to trust drummers.
Yeah, right.
So what would happen is we'd all be out in the room playing, And then you'd come in and the producer would say, let's listen to take 3, I really liked it. And they'd play back take 3.
Yeah.
And they'd go, you know what, Greg, you listen to the way that, you know, Matt pushed into that chorus, how exciting that is.
That's right.
Can you punch the bass line?
Exactly.
And just get that push it adds some excitement?
Yeah.
Now we'd be like, oh, the drummers are a little ahead there.
Right, yeah.
But it used to be we trusted it.
Yeah.
We used to think, and to me, I still do because I'm not Matt Chamberlain, I'm not Victor Indrizzo, Blair, Denny, I'm not one of these great guys. So for me, it's like...
How can we not trust them?
I got to trust them.
That's right.
Because that's what's exciting about the Who records, or is that the fills got faster.
Yeah.
You know, you get that snare fill, it should be like boom, it would just be so fast, and then there'd be a sucking in the stomach, and then the downbeat would come in so heavily. Now we'd be like,
this is what we love about music.
Yeah.
Yeah. And guys like you and I, we want to try and preserve that. We know everything's cyclical, right? If we push for this like enough, it's gonna, you know, we're gonna bring that story back alive. You know,
Dave Jerden had a great analogy of me. Like when I worked with him years ago, he was like, anybody can do this. Anybody can turn a knob or pull a fader. And what he means by that is like anybody can do this job. It's just knowing when to do it.
Right. That's right.
So look, when to go, that drum fill is so exciting, I want to keep it.
Yeah. I think that's why, like, you know, one of the things that really resonated with me when I started to see your series was it became very evident to me quickly that, like, you're really a fan of music. You know, like, you were affected by, again, I keep going back to this golden age or whatever. I think until some of the current songwriting moves me as much as that era, and I have the constant battle in my own head, is this because it's the typical, you know, I grew up with this music and therefore it means more to me and I can't get past it, but there's actually incredible stuff going on? Or is there validity to the fact that I'm just not relating to a lot of the songwriting that's going on right now in say, the rock realm, you know? What
I find is a common thread here in America, even though this album I'm about to say was successful in England, but it seems to have really shaped our generation over here, was George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. I looked at the Wikipedia the other day and I couldn't believe how many millions of copies it sold over here.
Yeah.
And then I meet guys like Chris Seefried and guys, our contemporaries, and everybody's name-checking that record.
Yeah.
And, you know, and they're all American, not all, but a lot of American players, like Jim Keltner we're talking about. It has a very... It's British because it's a Beatle, but it has a lot of American influence on it.
Yeah.
So that doesn't have to be the record.
Sure.
But is there anything in the back of your mind that, you know, you're chasing? Because to me, I know I'm chasing A Night at the Opera, that same feeling.
I see what you mean, yeah.
You know.
I mean, for me, I think I'm such a fan of so many different types of music. You know, I grew up, you know, I kind of have to transport myself back to the beginning, right? So I'm 11, 12 years old. It's 1981, 82. K-Rock is a huge station in Los Angeles. New Wave was at its height, you know, the post-punk thing. I really gravitated toward a lot of those kind of, you know, post-punk New Wave bands like Echo and the Bunnymen, New Order, you know, the Police, everything that K-Rock was kind of peddling at the inception of like MTV, and that whole convergence really like moved me in a powerful way. You know, I watched MTV the day it launched. So, you know, for me, you know, the images to music and everything kind of linked up with that was the beginning of music for me. So I think that when I'm thinking in terms of chasing something musically, depending upon what I'm working with, I always see that as almost like the encyclopedia that I'm referencing. That's why I love stuff like Spotify, because if I'm in a studio and, you know, say I'm working with an alternative band, if a song is sort of, for some reason, it's hitting me in a certain way and I want to reference a sound, you know, I'll kind of jump onto Spotify and go, what was that kind of, you know, what was the snare, you know, sound like? Or what, you know, I'm kind of constantly referencing it, but I wouldn't say I'm chasing something specific in terms of like a record or a genre per se. It's more based in, you know, how can I maximize the potential of this thing that I'm working on now, and would looking back on things that it's reminding me of benefit it in some way, or, you know, or not. And I kind of figure that out, you know, when I'm there, if it feels natural or not. Yeah.
So let's go back to Bring Down the Horse for a second.
Sure.
So you started at Groove Master?
That's right. Yeah.
How did you end up?
And then we ended up at, you know, that record was, we bopped around, just I think probably scheduling issues going on at the time. But so we started off with the engineer who did a lot of the Alice in Chains stuff. You know, we started off with Toby Wright, who might not, like, by name, you might not think of him as somebody that would be working on an album like Bringing Down the Horse, but funny guy, great record side manner, like Neal Avron, who, you know, engineered part of that record too, and was early in his career, but you knew the guy was going somewhere when you were working with him, you know, Neal. Just a terrific guy, I don't need to tell you. For some reason, we switched over to Sunset Sound, and we did one headlight and 3. But everything, again, right, tracked live. We had Fred Tackett, actually, from Little Feat, became sort of the main guitar player on the record. He did all the tracking with us. He played electric, acoustic, dobro. I would say that most people probably don't know, but the main band that did all the tracks, it was, you know, Jakob on vocal and rhythm, Fred Tackett on guitar, Rami Jaffee on organ and piano, me on bass, and Matt Chamberlain on drums. That was the band.
It's a heck of a band.
Yeah, that was the band for the whole record. And then for overdubs, T-Bone brought in a bunch of background singers, you know, Michael Penn, Gary Lewis from the Jayhawks, Sam Phillips did some singing. And then guitar-wise, it was fleshed out by, you know, John Bryan, who's obviously an amazing everything. He's a force of nature. Very unique guitar player and added a lot to the record, really. So yeah, that's kind of, you know, it's really easy for me to talk about how all these other people that I love, you know, but it's been an interesting 20-some years.
Yeah. So what are you doing now with your life?
So I left band life in 2013. I think it's safe to say that I kind of always white-knuckled touring. You know, I love the process of making records, but I found out kind of early on, it kind of dawned on me like, oh, I got to go out and promote this thing now and leave and be in a different city every day. And I think I'm a typical homebody in a sense. I think what I liked about touring was the show, but I struggled with having the rest of the day, you know, being away. You know, friends would always say, well, don't you do things when you're on the road? I say, yeah, I do things all the time. I'm just not necessarily doing what I want to be doing, which is, you know, being in LA, working on a record, you know, staying in one place. It's just kind of how I am. I did all of that and put in a ton of touring over the last 20 years. And, you know, as my son got a little bit older and I was gone, you know, now with the changes in the business and everything and having to be on the road much longer, being gone 8 months a year, just, it wasn't working for me anymore. I think a lot of people can kind of, you know, relate to that with the changes in the business. And so in 2013, I decided, you know, it's become Groundhog Day for me a little bit, like the touring thing. We did a lot of what there is to do out there. You know, we did all the late night shows over and over again, and, you know, made the rounds all over the world. And I just kind of felt like I've done this, and there's other things I want to get to. And so I left the band in 2013, and it was the first time I kind of look back and realized it was the first time in 30 years that I hadn't been in a band. I went from 1983 to 2013, I went from one band to the next, you know. Obviously the Wallflowers being a huge chunk of that with the 20 years, but I took about 8 months after that to really kind of think about, like, what do you want to do now? You know, what's next? You know, you don't want to tour, you don't want to be in a band anymore. You want to be a father that's around. And I kind of had to do some real soul searching because, you know, I knew what I didn't want to do, but I wasn't quite sure of where I was headed. And I kind of looked at the landscape of the industry and I realized that I had an interest in the tech side of things. I had an interest in where the business was headed. But mainly, I had a friend who's like a big chief marketing officer up in Silicon Valley ask me a really important question. Like, you know, what are you trying to achieve? Like, you know, what do you really want to do? And I said to her, I think that I want to somehow try and play a role in bringing like a middle class back to the music business. I don't know how I would do that. I don't know where that would lead me, but that's something that's important to me because I rode that arc of, as we talked about earlier, right? Like it was a business that kind of worked. Obviously the record companies always had their hands in everyone's pockets and there was always, you know, am I being paid fairly or whatever? But it was a business that worked, and it worked in a usual kind of way. I
think one of the things I think about when you say that, that I think is important for people to understand. I know that if you were in a successful band, it sucked that you were getting 13% of a reduced rate because you were literally getting a couple of percent of what the money that was coming in. However, it allowed record companies to go out and sign 99 bands that didn't recoup because the one band that did recoup made them enough money to do it. So it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah.
It sucked for the band that sold a few million copies going, wow, we could have, if we did this independently, but they were afforded that ability to have take a lot more risks than they do now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now they don't take those risks.
That's right.
Because of the way record sales are, unfortunately.
That's right. So, again, when I say, like, when I look back on what worked and, what I miss about it is just, that simple function of, we're putting something out, people are buying it, and it allows this entity to kind of go out and look for other talent. We actually, we had a really, really savvy manager back then, and he got us Andrew Slater.
Oh, Andy Slater.
Who actually was the one that, he had a stable of musicians that he kind of put together and kind of felt there was a thing, that late 90s, early 2000s, where we did a handful of records together that did well, where there was artistry and it was also, the songs were great and catchy,
Andy Slater, for people who don't know, ended up running Capitol.
That's right. But I was trying to think of ways that I could kind of, inject finance and life back into the business side of music. And so what I did was I started a website in 2014. I wanted to get more into the tech world, but because of my producing and playing background, I just didn't think anybody in the tech world would take me that seriously. So I kind of felt like I had to create something on my own to get people in that world to go, oh, this is an interesting person and maybe he has some value to add in our realm. So what I did was I started a site called Uncover, which was spelled UNKOVR. And basically the premise of that site, which operated throughout 2014, was that I was doing much like you are with the interviews, right? I was going to top professionals in the music business, be it, producers, mixers, mastering guys, engineers, songwriters, people in bands, even the occasional, comedian or actor, and basically asking them who their favorite unsigned talent was to promote to the public, and they kind of put their stamp on it on the site. And we had songs and videos and all the social media and everything on the site so that people could like discover new talent. So I felt like when the budgets dried up and in the kind of mid to early 2000s and things were really changing, one thing that I noticed was that now people were setting up home studios and they were toiling away in their studios at home. As an industry, a lot of people didn't really know what each other were working on. So Dave Way was actually the first guy that I called, and he said, God, this is a great idea. I was going to try and do something like this with my brother. Sure, I'll be a part of it. I'm working with this band. I think they're fantastic. And, the whole idea was, because what Dave said to me was, I love this idea because I wonder what my peers are doing. Everybody's at home, working on stuff. Nobody knows what anyone's doing. And so I cultivated this thing for about a year where I think I ended up with 102 tastemakers and about 250 bands. Wasn't really necessarily thinking of how to turn it into a business per se. But what started to happen was certain producers would see artists that other tastemakers were representing and, hey, can I work with that singer? I've got a track. I need a vocalist. This person's perfect. I started to kind of see how, there was a little bit of a community, almost like a musician, a Local 47 kind of directory, come to life, where people were starting to get work and do interesting things off of discovering things on the site. Now, 3 years later, I realized that Uncovered becomes somewhat of a predictor of future talent and stars because of who was recommending it. So what I mean by that is Slim Kid 3 from the Far Side was one of my tastemakers on Uncover. He chose Fantastic Negrito as an artist that he was touting, who then last year won the Contemporary Blues Album of the Year. Tom Windish from the Windish Agency is one of the biggest booking agents. I think he moved over to Paradigm. He was the tastemaker for an artist he was touting at the time named Gallant, who was just a Best New Artist in the Best New Artist category on the Grammys. And then Adrian Miller was managing Anderson .Paak. So I had Anderson .Paak on the site in 2014, who subsequently then got signed by Dr. Dre. And, he's kind of like a real D'Angelo, Prince kind of multi-talented, singer, drummer, collage artist almost, like a really interesting guy. So I did Uncover for a year. And then I got hit with a real dose of irony, like for the first time in my life, which I think it's evident right now that I've jumped around a lot and tried to experience different things. It's just, my curiosity, for better or worse in my own life at times, right, has taken me these different places because of my interests. But so what ended up happening was something very interesting, and I don't want to say controversial, but I definitely, talked to a lot of friends about it before I made the move. So about 16 years after Napster, which obviously made its debut off of utilizing the, peer-to-peer download protocol, right, that Bram Cohen created with BitTorrent and all of that. What a lot of people probably don't know is that BitTorrent itself had a VOD site called BitTorrent Now, where willing music makers, willing filmmakers were publishing their material on BitTorrent Now, which was a site for different media that they had. And the new CEOs of BitTorrent were making a media pivot, right? They were going in a different direction. And they saw my site through a friend of mine that had told them about it. And they asked me to run their music division. And at that point, I was a bit skeptical because the Wallflowers' third album was one of the first albums to be blown out by Napster. It was all over Napster. We went from selling, 5 million copies of Bringing Down the Horse to selling 500,000 copies of Breach, the follow-up that we did with Michael Penn. So I had all sorts of emotions. It was like, okay, well, we're 16 years past Napster in the sort of collapse and, due to piracy and all of that. But I'm being offered this really bizarre position as an artist of like running a platform that stems from that background. So I reached out to a ton of my friends and I said, I have this opportunity. These guys are very artist friendly. They're giving artists 90% on the dollar behind the paywall, with PayPal and Stripe. They've already put out Tom York's first solo record.
Sure.
They've already done deals with Slash and Bill Nye and all sorts of artists. By the time I got to the platform, it was already 3-4 years in the, from the inception, and they'd already had about 30,000 willing content creators publishing legally. And so I went out to a bunch of friends and I told them about this kind of ironic opportunity that I have as an artist, and I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, even though I felt the intentions of the CEOs were pure and were very artist friendly. 6 out of 7 people said, go for it. You could take something that has a tarnished image and turn it into something fantastic for artists. Wouldn't that be a great ending to this story? One of my friends was very, you're going to ruin your reputation. Do not go work there. These are the, this is the enemy. They created the download protocol that's ruined our industry. But at the end of the day, I just kind of felt like...
Can I pause there for a second? Because that's interesting, because of all the people that complains about not getting paid well enough is Tom York. So if Tom York has already released on that, I almost feel like it's null and void, that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason that these guys came to me was that they knew that, obviously coming from the artist side and being in Los Angeles my whole life and knowing a lot of people, I think they felt that they'd had a tough road with those tech guys, and the head of that firm going to agencies like, CAA and trying to state their case. But when I walked in to CAA and went to, say, the president of television and told them, hey, it's 16 years past Napster, you got to get over this. This is a different kind of platform. No one's giving artists the type of split that these guys are.
Sure.
In my inbox next morning was some pretty incredible projects that we had our pick from. I think it's a lot of this has to do, and you understand this, I'm sure, a lot of this just has to do with, are you a good communicator? And
Sure.
where are you coming from, right? Like somebody from the artist community now is saying, look, we can't take back the open source protocol. It's out there in the world. It's going to be there whether we like it or not. But can we take, and by the way, it's a very long story in terms of like what the company's intentions were, right? It wasn't created to have this effect, but it was a byproduct of it, unfortunately. A lot of people don't know that, and by the way, I'm not pushing this technology as much as just saying that, like, I didn't know a lot about peer-to-peer and the function until I got there. And what's very interesting to me is that, it powers platforms like Amazon and Facebook, just for the sheer magnitude of users.
Sure.
That sort of technology allows it to kind of be up and running in the fashion and working fashion seamlessly that it is. So anyway, without belaboring the point too much, you know, I had a real opportunity to try and turn that platform into something really, really great for artists, and we brought a ton of really cool projects to the plate, and we had some really great projects brewing, some partnerships with some really big companies, and you know, we put Ted Melfi's film bundle up, which, you know, he did, you know, his short film bundle. He people know him from Hidden Figures, directing and writing, and, you know, St. Vincent with Bill Murray. I did stuff with, you know, Allison Iraheta from American Idol, Jack Irons, the drummer from Chili Peppers, and just did a lot. We did some stuff with Interscope with Skylar Grey. You know, a lot of interesting projects that we were putting out on this platform. And then in typical fashion, about a year into it, the Chinese VC just decided that they didn't want to be in the media business anymore. I'm guessing it had to do somewhat with the price of content, and it's a very tough sector to play in. Just the amount of money, you know, that it takes to kind of get some of this material over onto your platform is maybe a bit more than some in the tech world want to chew off, and they try it and then they back off of it. So that was sort of an interesting year of my life. It really does kind of play into, you know, trying to shape the future of, you know, how people are being paid. And, you know, because I don't think that there's a music platform yet that's satisfying both the artist and the fan to the fullest extent, right? We know what the problems are that people are fighting for with the pay and the way that works, and how the labels have sunken their teeth into the streaming services, and all the money's being paid to them, and that they're really the ones that are doling out such small amounts to the bands. It's not necessarily the streaming services, right?
I have independent artists that make anywhere from $500 to $2,000 a month off Spotify, and they're very happy. Yeah, because they are making this extra income, and they don't have to maybe work 40 hours a week doing a coffee or working in a bar or whatever. Right. Now they can, maybe they don't have to work a part-time job. Maybe that $2,000 keeps them going. So they're fine because they own all of that money. The people that are complaining a lot, the problem is they're signed to massive old school record deals. Yeah. And they're getting 13% of what the label's getting after recoupment. That's right. And that's all very well for them to complain, but it's a different conversation. The conversation, independent artists are quite happy to make $2,000, $500 to $2,000 extra income a month. Right. They're very, very happy. Yeah. But for a large...
But when you're generating huge amounts of money, and you're, you know, realizing that you're getting just a freckle of that, a small percentage. It's,
because you're signed to a traditional record deal that they've already spent $20 million on promotion on you.
Yeah. That's right.
And these independent artists haven't had $20 million worth of tour support, of expensive videos and 20-year careers. Yeah. You know. Yeah. So those voices, and we're talking about some of my favorite artists that are complaining, don't get me wrong. Yeah. I just think that we need to have a bigger conversation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. There's got to be a united front. Yeah. I think when the music industry takes on Congress and talks about all of this stuff, I think that if there's too many kind of disparate voices, you know, like, you know, just too many kind of groups off on their own, I think that it just needs to be kind of centralized and really kind of speak the truth of what's really going on here, which is people aren't being paid fairly for what they're doing, and these are the reasons why, and this is what has to change. Yeah.
And what I would love to see is it's great that we can get united between the legacy artists that have got long-term careers. Yeah. But all of them have got, you know, their mansions and their big bank accounts. Yeah. What we need to be doing is helping and focusing entirely on helping people that are up and coming. Yeah. That's our only energy.
Yeah. Well, that's like, for example, right? That's like why, you know, not to be speaking disparagingly against Tidal, but that's why Tidal missed such a great opportunity when they launched, right? It was like they had 12 millionaires on stage talking about how things aren't fair and we're going to change things. You know, had they had a few voices from the community of people that, you know, maybe haven't been that fortunate, you know, kind of explain, you know, what needs to happen, it would have been a little bit more convincing to the public, right? You see people that the only people who have been paid well are the ones arguing for more money, and the public reaction to that was like, you don't need any more money. Yeah. You know, it didn't represent really, you know, all of the people that are being hurt by this. It was, 10 of 50 people that are making a real living in a business where millions are suffering. So that in a nutshell, kind of philosophically, kind of became a little bit about what I have been trying. I've been trying to find my way and add to, the positivity there. Even though like I have that year stint where it seemed like a little bit of a bizarre move, I saw it as, well, if I can take this sector and really make something great happen, then maybe something really interesting could be going on. Right? What a great end to a story of something that started off with a difficult kind of slippery slope that maybe at the end of the day could be the thing that helped artists more than anyone else is willing to.
All right, Greg. Who's this? This is Jonathan.
This is my buddy Jonathan Sheldon. He is.
How are you?
Yeah,
good to meet you.
Welcome.
The owner of Stand Sound Post.
Marvelous. So this is your new venture.
This is my new venture.
Tell us about your new venture.
Well, I'll take it.
Yeah.
So this is Jonathan and I have been friends for probably, I'd say, going on over 30 years now.
Yeah.
We've always sort of been in the periphery of each other's lives.
Yeah.
We had the same music teacher growing up, and interestingly, his family rented a house next door to mine when we were growing up as teens. Yeah. But always kind of ran into each other here and there, but and always got along. But we weren't necessarily the kind of friends that went out and had dinner and all that stuff. And what ended up happening was when I left the band, and then I told you I went into the tech world for a while. After my last job ended, I started to consult for media and tech. And it was around that time that I think, again, once showing our age here, through Facebook, Jonathan reached out to me and said, hey, what are you doing? I see that you're consulting, and I've got a post facility, post sound facility. We should meet up. Maybe there's some way we can work together. And so I would say maybe like a few months ago, we sat in this very theater, and I ran an idea by him that I'd kind of had for a couple of years. I think I told you earlier, I went to film school before I joined the Wallflowers and worked in the film business for about 6 months. And then that kind of got sidelined for a while, but I always had an interest in that world. And lately I'd been thinking, why isn't there some sort of hybrid or combination where, there's a one-stop shop situation for, once principal shooting of either like a film or a commercial or a TV show is done, why are people not able to kind of go to one place and say, this is where we can get our sound mixed and, the ADR and the Foley work, but also maybe there's a division that helps people pick a composer and, writers for incidental music and put bands together on top of all that sound post work. Because not everybody has their one composer that they use. We talked about it, maybe 30% of the business has like somebody that they kind of rely on constantly. And, Jonathan was like, God, that's a really good idea, and I've been thinking about how to incorporate a music division into this, but I guess, my plan that I went over with him made sense to him, and, being a gutsy guy who goes on instinct and his feelings, he said, let's do this, and we put a one sheet together about kind of how we wanted to do it, and now we're starting to get clients, and helping people pick composers and put their music together. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Yeah.
I like that idea because that takes the power back a little bit.
Well, well, that's a part of it I think we discussed, right?
One of the things that I see a lot in post audio is that the music is tracked along the same schedule as the post sound, so it's a 5 or 6 week schedule depending on the film. And what Greg and I were thinking of doing was, let's get in early on these movies. Let's give these filmmakers an opportunity to work with, Greg's colleagues, the best musicians in town, and let's really create a battle plan to make music like a primary focus of the movie. I had always thought there was a need for it, but I was hesitant to start offering that without the right person chairing the department. And when Greg and I spoke, I was like, let's do it.
Yeah,
it's a great idea because then you can think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah,
that's right.
And not just go back to the usual suspects every time.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we're kind of that's what we're kind of encouraging is that, growing up, and all these movies from the 60s and 70s and 80s that had these great soundtracks, as we talked about, had really good incidental music or, really great themes, and maybe there was sort of a main song that they could kind of market, you know, we reference like, you know, like a Rumblefish, you know, you had Stuart Copeland and Stan Ridgway from Wall of Voodoo had a hit song with Don't Box Me In. But when you listen to the soundtrack, you know, when you listen to the score of it, you know, it was very thematic and it kind of had a sound, you know. And I think that it's safe to say we can all agree that, you know, the music side of media has been sort of like, you know, a lot of, you know, there's been a lot of budget cutting there. It's been the place people look to kind of go, hey man, you know, there's a lot of exposure here, but we don't have a lot of money.
Well, I think that's, I totally understand.
Yeah.
But I think what you're doing here is good because if you start it at an earlier time,
that's
not
right.
so much about the finances, but the creativity's greater.
Oh, yeah.
Because what's happening is music becomes marginalized because it's the last thing people think about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, we've only got $8 left. What can we do?
That's right. Yeah.
That is right. And a lot of times, filmmakers end up in a box because they haven't had these front end discussions and they haven't had a chance to allow a musical person to absorb the visuals, absorb the story, and then come in with motifs and even songs that are directly related to the film. In the studio world, of course they do that because it's not only just like better for the movie, but it's a great marketing tool and it allows the film to work with the music in a way that's connected, profound.
Sure.
But in independent films, we haven't had that as much. So I'm very excited about those services we're going to be offering, and the initial response has been great. We've been going out to producers and filmmakers, and I can tell this idea is going to work. It's just we got to just pound the pavement.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I think the biggest differentiator is going to be the creativity. And why I say that is I just saw Dunkirk, which is an amazing movie, and everybody's talking about Hans Zimmer and stuff. But being English or being British, I watched the movie, I'm like, the strongest theme in the movie is Elgar. And it's Nimrod. And it's this beautiful piece of very, very famous British music that is very stirring and moving. So what was creative about it, not taking anything away from Hans Zimmer, was the fact that somebody smart, probably him, said, how can I create this sense of this British euphoric, this moment when all these like little boats come in, like 1,100 like fishing boats come to rescue 300,000 or 400,000 people, and it's so powerful an image for us growing up in Britain. And so what did he do? He took one of the most famous pieces of British music, which is not really well known, but it's very smart. And it's this very crescendoing piece that grows and grows and grows. And then it gets, just as it gets about to get massive, it sucks down and comes down. So it takes you on this.
Oh, yeah.
So my point is like, it's having the creativity. If you can get in early enough on when you're editing something and you can start suggesting stuff.
That's right. Again,
it's coming back to my earlier point. I'm in danger of repeating myself, obviously.
No, but it's a great point because
the earlier the better.
Right.
The idea that we're gonna what we're gonna be able to do for these films and these media projects, whether it's a series, episodic, is go through the script and then have a battle plan musically for the filmmakers, for the producers, and then go execute that, not in this sort of way that you're tripping on yourself, but in a way where you're able to go in and say, all right, here's the spot list of musical cues that we're going to accomplish, and this is the mood and the tone that we're going to achieve, and then let's get a group of people that are going to be inspired together to do this in a way that's very tactical, with great studio, with great engineering, and just a quality of music that's that isn't always had in these pictures.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's quite exciting. So have you started on any projects yet?
Yeah, we've just gotten our first film in, and we spot another picture tomorrow, which is a period piece. So we started the... We've started.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, right, is again, not to be redundant here, but I think that, we went out to, as he said, producers and directors, and they really are interested in starting this process early. You know, because,
that's a good point.
You know what I mean? Like it's interesting, right? Like you wonder, like when sometimes it's not done that way. Well, sometimes just because you didn't present the opportunity.
Right.
So it's like, wait a minute. Oh, we can start this now. We can start tweaking it and thinking about it.
Yeah.
And a lot of these movies are just so enhanced by the score and by what's
there's nothing worse than making decisions based in desperation, fear, and lack of budget and not enough time to figure it out.
And how many times have a film gets to the end and they've been temping songs that they love, whether it's you know classic rock songs or what have you, and then the reality is they don't have the budget for these songs.
That's right.
So they do tired versions. They sort of sound somewhat like what they really wanted. Here's an opportunity to actually create from the ground up real music that is inherent and created with the sense of the movie itself.
And also, I think an understanding. What I think of that is, my mind immediately went to a sound-alike piece I had to do a few years ago. And I won't say who the band is, but it was a very indie, trendy, cool band, and they had a temp piece in there, and it was just like a little 20-second instrumental piece. And a friend of mine came to me and said, they want 50 grand. And this is a short film. It's a 15-minute film about my mother's father. His mother's father had just died, and it was her reconciling this relationship, and she wasn't able to, she had to sort of like reconcile the relationship, but he was already dead. And so it was this beautiful film, and this little indie band wanted 50 grand. Interestingly enough, just as a sideline, Jeff Buckley's estate gave them Last Goodbye for free.
There you go.
So sometimes you get people that are classy and they watch the film and get it. But there's that sort of thing, because it's about the relationship. It's like, so if you understand the film, you're in early enough, you can also go and talk to people and go, hey. Because when it's last minute, it's desperation.
That's right.
They go to
you don't want to be operating reactively with stuff like that, because it's just, it just seems to be the first place that, dries up financially, right? Like, oh, you got a buddy that can help out, and it's just that, I don't think when you're coming off of like a handful of decades of like amazing scores and amazing soundtracks, I just think that's just, that's not the way to be thinking. Like you're not gonna get a great accompaniment thinking that way.
That's right.
Like, oh, this is just the place to cut corners. It's like, those great movies you like, those people weren't thinking that way. So let's get back to that, right? Because a lot of this really is, maybe, people haven't quite put something together the way we are with like a post-sound house and also offering music services to people, right? Because again, not everybody has, you get a commercial being made. It's not like they necessarily have a composer, and a lot of these people are happy to kind of say, oh, you know people? Oh, great, yeah, because we don't know what we were going to do for that, and you kind of seize it early. And again, right, there's a big difference, as we discussed, between, a company, like an entity, talking to another production entity about the music budget versus a producer or director talking directly with an artist, and then we know usually what the outcome financially is for the artist in that equation. Right.
Well, and the artist is going to be, they're going to gravitate towards it because they're going to feel like they're part of the creative process. You're being brought in, as opposed to, look, I know the reality. And a lot of people watching know the reality. This is the reality. You get an email from blah, blah, blah music supervisor, and he sends it out to hundreds, possibly thousands of people who submit songs, and maybe the intern or somebody is listening through these songs. They're then maybe the top 10, 100 or whatever forwarded to another company who he's been hired by to collect songs. And they may or may not use that. Sometimes, and this is contentious and going to upset a lot of people, sometimes they just end up going, okay, cool, somebody else has done a song we like. Now we own this composer, he can copy it because that's the one that got approved. So it's a very unscrupulous business and it's very tough. What was great for many, many years was the reality is that you would hire people for the job and you'd work with them. And if you can get back to that reality, you're going to get so much more respect from the artist.
That's right.
And the artist is going to feel good about it because you go to the artist and go, this is what we need. And you've got to, please, these are the boundaries to work within. You can communicate directly with people. I mean, that's...
One of the improvements we see immediately that can happen in these projects is, going into a world-class studio, Greg overseeing them and having world-class musicians around, and then instead of getting, 2 months to meander through a score, it's like focus it, best in class for a weekend and come out with 30, 40 minutes of stuff that just indelible. And I think that's going to be a really cool improvement on these films. I watch these movies iterate, and the music, unfortunately, oftentimes is rushed, and it's given what you're talking about, which is a second-class servicing. And there's an opportunity here to use the same budget in a smarter way.
Yeah.
You know.
That's right.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think, you know, the only reactive portion of like why we're doing this is that we really do want to kind of bring back that fair, you know, compensation to musicians and composers and, you know, people that have been shortchanged a lot, you know, lately. That's not to say everyone's doing that, but
and just make the quality better.
That's right, and make it better.
Yeah.
You know, and everyone, you know, wouldn't it be nice to go see something and, you know, the score has a, you know, the memorable side of, say, like, you know, like the way you think of Star Wars or Jaws or, you know, like something that's, you know, you might remember the music even more so than, you know, the film.
Well, the Jaws in particular, I remember there's a shark and people die.
That's right.
But everyone's doing
exactly.
Dun, dun, dun,
You know, it's,
that's a great
we want to bring back that impact, you know, for sure. So it's more about the composition.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think but to the broader point of more creativity, I think there will be this natural thing that happens when you allow filmmakers to interface with musicians who are in it for the right reason early.
That's right.
And then it's not about dollar and cents. The deals have already been worked out, and then it's about let's find a pathway here to make this thing, you know, really special.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So,
you know, and the idea is to utilize, as he said, like a lot of the great musicians that are in town. Utilize the studios that we love, like the Sunset Sounds of the world, where you can go in there and let very creative people, you know, write to picture. And this is really what we're getting at, is that, you know, you got a couple of, you know, you find some people that understand the aesthetic and you kind of let them explore, and, you know, you bring the director in early so that he kind of understands like where things are headed, and you can nip it in the bud if it's not working. You don't like present the whole thing and then, you know, this isn't really what I, you know what I mean? It's like, whenever, you know about this, I mean, we talked about it a lot, about like the whole benefit of the collaborative process. Is anytime you get parties that are interested and involved, you know, making decisions and being a part of things, as opposed to just stay out, you know, you're gonna cut to the chase and wow, this is a really great, you know, that's a little off center from what we're trying, maybe make it a little dark or whatever the reaction is in the studio. You know, you want to make the client happy. Just like I always say this with like producing records. I'm going to fight for an idea that I believe in, but at the end of the day, I know it's that band's record and it's their record forever, and I want them to like it. So I can push for something as hard as I can, but there is a threshold. There's a point where I have to let go and go, it is your album. I'm going on to the next one. This is your catalog.
I've had that conversation many times.
Often
I say, look, I'm like, guys, girls, whatever, I'm like, this is not me being passive aggressive. This is a fact. At this point, this is my opinion. If it's different and you don't want to do it, I totally understand.
That's right.
And that usually they go, oh, okay, what were you saying again? Because once you let go,
that's right.
Once you let go of like holding on to your idea, they're more receptive. Because sometimes, you know, as an artist, they love the fight.
I think it plays into the elusive side of like record production, right? People always say like, well, what does a record producer do? And it's, you know, the answer is obviously there's a million answers, right? And in a million combinations, but really like,
I would say film director, talking of film.
Yeah.
Because remember Tim Burton, you've obviously read interviews or whatever or seen him interviewed. I remember one of the most famous quotes from Tim Burton a few years ago said, I wouldn't know a good script if it hit me in the head. And it was like, he's like, that's not what I do. I don't read scripts. He goes, people come to me with ideas. Somebody reads a script, tells me it's amazing. I'm a visual person. I suggest ideas to actors and let them do it. And I'm not going to take anything away from it. Some of Tim Burton's movies are some of the best movies ever made. I mean, Beetlejuice still is incredible.
He's smart enough to defer the script decisions to somebody who's a script person.
Right.
Because those scripts are certain. I mean, Beetlejuice is an amazing script. So somehow those decisions are getting made wisely. But yeah, it's interesting. Like,
but it's a beautiful movie.
I mean, exactly. Absolutely. Tim Burton takes these, you know, you've got 100 typed pages. He takes them and turns them. I mean, it's just the best ideas, absolutely realized. One of the points I just wanted to underline was, you know, oftentimes in movies you have composers who are toiling by themselves because of the necessity, the budget, and the way the schedule's set up. But just to have the energy of sitting in a room and spotting your movie with Greg and the company supporting this whole process, just to have a group of musicians to get excited about the visuals and bring that energy to the score. I mean, that itself is going to be a quantum leap for a lot of these pictures.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
As ever, please leave a bunch of questions and comments below. Maybe, you know what, can I get you to answer anything if anybody asks some questions?
Absolutely.
See how I did that on camera so he couldn't say no?
I can't say no. Yes.
So have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Check out, you know what, we'll put a whole bunch of links and stuff.
Sounds good.
All right. Speak to you all again very soon.
Thanks, everybody.